Started off as a presentation on varieties on the Queen Victoria numeral issue in Canada, but it took a bit of a twist, and I think you're going to see where it goes from this. So we started off, one of the famous ones in Canadian is number 74II. It's the major on position 18 of this half-cent numeral. And we're going to look at it more closely. It's in, of course, position 18 is there on the sheet, on the pane. This is a pane that fairly rare to have a complete pane, but it looks like it should be expensive for mint collectors. Well, they weren't too interested in it because it's missing some salvage on the right side and the bottom. But so I got it at, I thought, a very reasonable price because it shows the varieties. And Trimble, who's the authority on varieties and Canadian stamps, on re-entries in particular, reports that there's 22 of the stamps, 22 positions with re-entries. The major one is this one here, where we can see the marks here in an A and N, over in ST. That's what's documented. It's a very clear re-entry. And what I'm going to try to explain is how these re-entries appeared. And there's some observations that I'm going to talk about here quickly. First of all, it's an obvious vertical shift. And the mark in the A would suggest that pressure was applied to the left half of A only in terms of the transfer roll when it's pushed in. Well, the mark in the right half of N would suggest the opposite. That's inconsistent. You can't possibly have a mark in just a portion of a letter. And we go back to the S, we see it here, also in S. There's just a short mark. This was a nice full length line. But there's too many marks we see as, and we call them re-entries, and I have a theory on this. We're going to look at this particular thing in close detail here. And specific, each mark is just a line. There's a white gap between the mark and the solid portion of the plate, or the cave, if you will. That's where the ink is being deposited, where it's black. That's an inconsistency. If it was a re-entry that the transfer die was pushed onto the plate, well, why is it just a line? It should be a solid, because that whole plate was pushed there. It created the line, and it also filled in the area to the right of the line or above the line in both cases. So this is what this whole most of this presentation deals with now. Is why is that just a line? So in order to do that, is it a re-entry or is it something else? This is looked at position 13. I wanted to know what the N actually looked like. That's what it is in position 13. And then I recreated an image of in red to show what that N looks like. That's pretty good fit. Took a while because even the branches of the N, the two legs of the N aren't perpendicular. They're sloped inwards because of the oval shape. And then I created what the transfer roll would have looked like in order to push in on the plate. And where the blue is the raised portion of the transfer roll that pushes into the printing plate, forming and producing the recesses that collect the ink. So before I go any further, are there any questions so far about this? Because you have to understand that the blue is part from the transfer roll. It's an inverse image. It's actually raised and pushes into the printing plate. And where the red is, that is not affected. That stays high, basically. It's not recessed. So the ink goes where the blue is.
Arnie, before you put that blue over the image, I noticed, yes, there are some lines in the black area.
Oh, these ones up here. So there's position 18. Yeah, those lines are pretty similar there. So position 18 would have similar lines right here. These two, at least parts of the line are very similar. So that would suggest that actually was a raised portion on the transfer roll. So when we move that N over onto position 18 and then re-put that transfer roll down in that place, we'll see where the transfer roll would be. to create this on position 18. Okay. Now, but how is the re-entry produced? Well, the only way the re-entry can be produced, we have to agree that it was produced from the transfer roll, putting in a mark that was a little bit off, and not in quite the right position, or at least not in the same position as the blue one. Okay. This is the blue one. This is the final position. Okay, that's the actual with the red. This is where it would have been in the final position. And what we see here, though, is why is the yellow reentry? This is a question I'm trying to answer. Why is the yellow reentry just a line instead of being a solid? What we're seeing is just a portion of the line at the bottom, a little thin part of the line at the top. In fact, for this section, most of it is there. But it not, except for the last part, it's only a portion here that's actually red. I could have included that as that is part of the re-entry on this stamp. When we go back and look at it, we can see where that yellow dye did cause a little bit of an offset, a little bit of a lower area compared to the blue. So that's the question. Why is that not yellow? Why is that whole re-entry? Why is the whole letter not thinner at the top? That's really another way of rephrasing the question. Why is it just a line? Well, here's a theory. So my hypothesis, the marks were caused by now we keep in mind when I use the word marks, I'm not saying these lines are not referred to individually as re-entries in the plural. A re-entry is only, all these marks are part of one re-entry. That's just a definition. But my hypothesis is that these marks are from an earlier application that for whatever reason was defective and was deemed necessary to be burnished. Burnished is the removing of the old engraving or the old marks, the old image. And then the transfer roll was reapplied. But burnishing did not remove all traces of the earlier engraving. That's understood. Those are called residuals. That's a very appropriate term, although I'm going to suggest a new one. We should not be calling them re-entries, but we should be calling them pre-entries because they actually are pre everything else was done. But that's not the main point of it. They are residuals. I like the term. I also like a pre-entry as a term. But why is it just a line? Why does a re-entry appear as a line instead of solid? We have to understand that in a printing plate, there are the recesses where the ink collects, and then a wiper comes across, removes the excess ink, and then the paper is pressed on, and the ink is transferred onto the paper. That's fundamental intaglio printing or engraved stamp printing. That's the basics of that kind of style. But we're going to look closely at this printing plate now. The hypothesis is that when it's burnished, and the metal is first softened because it's hardened to be able to serve as a printing plate, and then it's soft. It changes state from hard to soft during the process. Metal is first softened, and then pressure is applied from the back to flatten the surface, to permit the transfer roll to be reapplied. But applying pressure at the very edge of the groove here, right there, and right on the inside there is very difficult, as the force, when you're pushing, the force vector isn't going to collapse this little piece. It's going to go right through the solid plate and transfer it onto the back plate. What you're going to see is that the central portion of the groove collapses easily, and I've showed that here. But the two corners, right here and right here, they don't collapse. And that's the hypothesis. That's why we see a line as a result of the burnishing, but it doesn't burnish it completely for whatever reason. And we see these as lines rather than solid entries. That's the idea. That's the whole gist of it. I think from an engineering perspective, yeah, I can understand applying pressure to the bottom of the plate. The vector is going to go right through this part, and it's not going to bend this little corner. The strongest part of this plate, of this notch, is right in the corner. Why do you stand in In a hurricane where the roof is going to collapse, you stand under a door where there's support right above you. Same idea. And you can understand how the pressure can be applied here. It will cause this central portion to collapse inwards easily. It won't have that same effect down here in the corners.
Arnie, this is very persuasive, but I'm wondering, there are re-entries from many countries, including the U.S., and there must be a considerable literature on re-entries, and I'm wondering whether your theory has ever been mentioned by anybody else, or is there any other description of how re-entries are done that would corroborate your theory?
I don't know. I haven't read literature. This whole theory, this whole idea only came up since Thursday morning. I'll be presenting this, and I'm sure there's others who are more familiar with. There are books on how engraved stamps are printed. I just don't have any access to those resources.
And so, Arnie, you're saying that we get the line on one side, but on the other side, it's going over where it's already inked, and therefore
Correct.
doesn't appear.
That's you're 100% right. The other end of this groove was covered by the final die.
And since the entire plate is done at one time, where these particular lines appear as a happenstance of the strength of the metal or whatever in that particular location.
Bingo.
Actually, it's a question of the thoroughness of the burnishing.
Right.
It's intuitively, the idea of re-entry seems to suggest just going over the plate again and impressing the transfer roll again. It hadn't occurred to me that the original impression had to be burnished out first.
I think in the majority of at least Canadian re-entries, it actually is a burnished and a residual rather. In some cases, certainly, when the whole line is doubled, the whole bottom of the stamp number 4A, the major on number 4. Yes, there's doubling in the 3s in the corners, there's doubling of the lettering, and there's doubling of the ovals. See, then it was actually done afterwards. But in the majority of the cases where it's just a mark, a small mark, and like we saw in the S and in the T's and these letters, I think I'm leaning more and more towards the fact that they're residuals or pre-entries. But now, like you asked the question, why was it burnished? Why was position number 18 re-entered? When we compare it with position 17, which is beside it on the pane, of course, this is position 18 with the major. What we see here is that even in its new position, it is still low, relatively low compared to position 17 beside it. When they did the initial re-entry, it's been burnished out. We know it was actually lower. So that's one reason why I honestly believe many of the re-entries we see are from residuals are because when they applied the transfer roll, it wasn't positioned properly. I can only imagine it'd be very difficult to put this steel transfer roll in precisely the right location when you're looking at millimeters of difference.
Well,
And
fraction.
so in this case, maybe one of the reasons was because it was too low. Because the original die, if we go back to what we know that, so I'm not going to go all the way back to the presentation. The final position for the transfer roll here was higher than the yellow. So when they did the yellow and they looked at where the stamp, they said, oh, we blew it, it's too low. Let's see if we can bump it up a bit. Let's burnish it out and move it up.
So when they do this, they have to burnish out the entire image?
Correct.
Basically start over again, in other words.
That's the only way. You couldn't do just part of the image.
Right.
You'd have to have a transfer roll that only had part of the image.
Right. So really the marks that are the indications of re-entries are entirely due to the incompleteness of the burnishing.
Correct.
Yeah, it's quite enlightening, if true.
So I'm thinking that's, as I said, incorrect placement is the reason why many plates are burnished and re-entered. The incorrect placement could have either been done during the initial plate production or during subsequent repairs when they see something's worn, something broken. on a plate, they may have to go in, burnish out the whole plate and re-enter it, because some re-entries are very clearly not on the plate proofs. There's enough evidence to say that many times the plates have been removed and the re-entry is done, and then plates are put back into service, and position number 28 on this plate, which in the plate proof didn't have any marks, suddenly now has a mark. Some images or some plates, or many plates have been removed and re-entered during the course of its use. Here's an
fact that-
example of one of that same re-entry on cover. We see exactly the same marks in the A and in the N and the top of the N. But another question, another example here. I think, okay, here we're going to look at number 75 III, where the III in the catalog shows it as having re-entries in the ones. Well, this is a very bizarre, unusual pair, because each of the 4 ones show a re-entry. We're going to look at the right-hand stamp. In the bottom left, we're going to start in the bottom left. We can very see that the lower left corner, there's a downward shift. In the lower right-hand corner, it's just a sideways shift here, down there, and the little faint line coming down the side of the 1. And in the upper right-hand corner, we see an upward shift. You can see the doubling of the leaves is up. There's some lines above it. The top margin is a little bit distorted. I've got to move that right there. You can see a line. So this is interesting to get it in 3 different shifts. Each normally a re-entry is in 1 direction, 2 directions. Now, can anybody, well, I've already said what the answer is here. I wanted to make it a question. The only possible explanation I see is that the initial entry was twisted when it was turned, or maybe not twisted, but it was turned not straight up and down. And then they decided, well, this is not right. This is not square. We have to burnish it all out, and we're going to give you we're going to put a new image back in, and we're going to put it straight this time.
Because it's straight now.
It's straight now.
Yes.
The new image is straight. So the final image, the dark image, this is straight. This was too low here. Here it's now in the middle properly, and here it's too high. Well, now they've lowered it in the top right, they raised it in the bottom left, and now it's not twisted anymore. Turned or rotated. Maybe a rotated would be a better. The initial re-enter was rotated slightly, maybe a fraction of a degree. And we get a hint of that when we look at this one down here. There is actually a bit of a twisting effect, but I think that's the only thing that makes any sense. And then they were all burnished out, and they left some plates. Now, again, it comes back. I haven't added this material to my presentation. Well, why do we see these lines here? Well, I think it was the same hypothesis before, that when the pressure is applied, because these are just small, right here, they couldn't apply strong pressure in these narrow grooves. They couldn't squish out the old groove because it was supported on both sides.
I'm deducing from what you say that you'll tend to find more re-entries on those lower denomination stamps, which are printed in vastly greater quantity than the higher ones.
100%, yes, for sure.
Does the plates wear out?
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the faint lines on the left-hand side, but on the right, there are no lines there in the spaces between the major lines. You were saying that you couldn't burnish out the marks on the left, but they seem to have succeeded on the right-hand side.
The original mark that was burnished out was in the same place as the new one, except
on the right-hand side,
shifted horizontally rather than vertically. When it's vertical shift, it can't be burnished out. And it's a horizontal shift. If these had been vertical lines, we would have seen the faint marks. We see it in the top again with a vertical displacement. If there are some vertical lines in here, we would not see it. Why would they burnish it out? Here's another issue of misalignment. Okay, here we see 2 stamps. I forgot the animations on this one too. I'm still working on this version. I'm looking first at the pair. where we can see the bottom margin here is grossly misaligned compared to the stamp to the right. This is another different pair. And so then, is it possible that somewhere along the line, they decided to fix these? Both stamps have re-entries, but I'm highlighting the one on the left. This corner down here, we can see the unburnished lines from an earlier entry lower there, down here in the corner, and this faint line that runs along here. There's a little bit of a hint of doubling down here under the one. There's certainly a doubling down in the bottom corner. Is it possible that after they did the left stamp and they realized, whoops, it's too low, they burnished it out, but not completely, and impressed it? Because even in the current position, it is still low. And can only imagine that what it was like before, it was even lower, because the final version is still low. Interesting that the right stamp was also shows a re-entry here. And I think they decided, well, we're going to try to move this one down. And in fact, when they did it, they moved it up and they gave up. In their second try, it was even higher than it was in the first try. So they said, forget it, we're going home. Ciderographer decided to give up and said, we're going to leave it. So there's a misalignment, could be a reason for burnishing and re-entering. This is another one. This is a famous one, Canadian. I'm not going to talk about it. This is not a re-entry. This is a misplaced entry. It's called the 10 cent on 1 cent. Somehow somebody decided that there's a re-entry down here. There's a difference here, what you're looking for, and that's what it's all about. And this is a copy number 2. But I also had to include another variety. Here's the bisect, number 78. That's a 3 cent numeral. I got the wrong color there. It's not yellow brown at all. Oh, and the important thing here was that the 2 cent rate had come into effect only 11 days earlier with what's called imperial penny postage. And so it's very likely that the post office could have been short of 2 cent stamps. So they used a bisect 3 cent as a 1.5 plus the ½ cent to make it 2 cents.
Yeah.
Here's another interesting one. This is the same numeral issue with a very unusual C-flaw down there. And also with pre-print increase. That's it. Just a couple extra varieties from previous presentation.